First off, gold had a great year. And I think everybody who watched gold knew that it got fairly overbought in the near term. And so we were expecting some sort of pullback. So to the extent that we're still trading here kind of around 2,700-ish, I think flat is a win for gold holders. I think there were several of us who were thinking this pullback could be pretty sizable. If it ends up not being any deeper than it's already been, I think gold holders can really breathe a good sigh of relief. The market environment has decidedly become more risk on. And so that's obviously less favorable for gold. Not quite as much of a tailwind, obviously. That's the thing that I have my eye on the most right now is, depending upon which metrics you look at, stocks are either more richly valued than they've been at many points in history, or they are the most overvalued they've ever been in history. And I got a couple of stats. Well, let me just read through them right now. We all know that the Buffett indicator is at the highest level it's ever been at, and that's a general finger to the wind sign of market overvaluation. The S&P so far, because the year's not over, has made 57 new highs in 2024. Cyclically adjusted PE ratios are above 38 times right now. There's only been one other time in history where it's been higher. That was the dot-com bubble. Goldman Sachs, more or less sort of a warning about this. I'll just pull out one nugget from it. Trump and the new administration's rhetoric and Trump's recent appearance on the New York Stock Exchange floor walk fan the already blustery U.S. political tailwinds and the sense of market enthusiasm. We now have a market where you've got companies like Apple trading at 10 times sales. Now, that is an absolutely crazy valuation multiple. For those that mentioned the warning that Scott McNealy famously gave, CEO of Sun Microsystems during the dot-com bubble, he talked about when Sun hit a 10 times sales valuation, and he basically said, look, you guys don't get it. For the next 10 years, I can't spend a dime on anything. I have to give it all to you for the next 10 years. I can't pay salaries. I can't invest in the company. I can't buy more product. That's what would justify this 10 times sales valuation you're currently giving me, essentially saying you guys are nuts. Obviously, history proved him right. We have Apple basically at the same milestone, and Apple is a company that its sales have pretty much gone nowhere for the past 4 years. I mean, it's not growing sales, but we're putting this gargantuan sales multiple on it. Even Walmart, which has had a great year, their stock is trading right now at almost 40 times earnings, which is bananas for a company like that. We have this strong sense of euphoria. In fact, there's a metric called the euphoria meter, and it's a composite of things like forward PEs and the VIX and whatnot. But in the data set that they have for it, which started in the early 90s, it has never been this high. So yet another sign of extreme valuations. And the thing I like to remind people is we call them extremes for a reason, which is that they don't last. They revert by definition. That's what you have to be an extreme. We're currently trading at extremes around the board, but it shows that investors are they're all in, right? That is not an environment for the precious metals to thrive. They're obviously much more of a risk-off asset. And, for those people whose eyes were opened to this inflation insult that we all experienced from COVID, there has been a debate. Well, what's the better asset to own? Gold, bullion, or Bitcoin, right? Because we are in a risk-on environment, that is very favorable for a highly speculative asset like Bitcoin. And so I think to a certain extent, in the short term, the market is saying, oh, I guess the winning store of value against inflation right now is Bitcoin because I get inflation protection and I get to see the price jump up by thousands of dollars every day. Obviously, that's the belle of the ball right now versus gold. And so it's another reason why I think the market is just taking a breather from the attention it was giving gold. From an overall perspective, U.S. housing market is in a really bad state in the sense that it's just frozen. And it's interesting because you look at our average home price, it's still hanging up there. I think it actually set a new all-time high in 2024 versus 2023. But then you have to, look into what's going on here. And it's transaction volume has totally dried up, right? And that's because housing has hit record levels of unaffordability. So really what you have here is the wealthy basically trading houses with each other. And obviously wealth in general is correlated with age. So you've priced out, all the younger generations. And it's basically just, I'm painting with a big broad brush here, obviously, but it's rich boomers, trading with each other. And that's what's setting currently the value for housing. One of two things, really needs to start happening very quickly. Housing needs to become a lot more affordable, right? And there's really only one of two ways that that's going to happen. It's going to be that, either interest rates come down materially, and that's starting to happen. But as we've all seen, the Fed started its rate cut regime, and what did mortgages do? They actually went higher. The other thing that could happen is, people could start making an awful lot more money, and the job to housing price ratio starts getting better. It doesn't look like the cavalry is going to be riding anytime soon on that, right? So the other way that housing could become a lot more affordable is prices could come down. And I think that is the much more realistic, much more probable one here. What's going to determine that is inventory, right? As more inventory starts coming into markets, people are just going to have more options. And we're already beginning to see that happen in more and more metros across the US. A lot of places in Texas, a lot of places in Florida. I mentioned Melody Wright earlier on. She has a database that she tracks countrywide super closely. She's now beginning to see weakness in California. And she says, look, if California really gets on this train of increasingly having what she calls motivated sellers, we hear about motivated buyers a lot, but motivated sellers, that's going to then start having contagion across the rest of the country. Now, real estate, it varies dramatically. Your mileage is definitely going to vary on a local level here. And there are certain parts of the country where inventory is legitimately tight. You're not going to have some of the issues that you're having in Texas and Florida from an inventory standpoint. But there are a lot of real estate markets where people have said, you know what, we've got this national inventory shortage and, my area doesn't have a lot of available inventory right now, so we're immune to it. I think a lot of those markets are going to find themselves getting a really rude wake-up call. And to many of the housing experts that I talk to, it's not that we have a housing inventory shortage, like in terms of number of units, we just have an ownership distribution issue, right? So like a lot of those units, especially this cycle in the housing market past 10 years, a lot more got bought by institutions, the short-term rental landlord, right, who wanted to buy a couple Airbnbs and become a passive income millionaire, right? Can't go wrong, get rich quick scheme, right? And the bloom's off the rose on a lot of those things. And so what you're beginning to see happening, especially in some of the markets that I mentioned, is you're beginning to see these investors who got in this last wave, who for them, buying the house was an Excel decision, right? They're not living in it. It's not the roof over their head. And they're getting to the point where they're like, oh, you know what? Like this thing is just not cash flowing the way that we thought it was. Get rid of it. And you got a lot of institutions that oftentimes own multiple properties. You get a lot of these short-term rental people. And again, they kind of clumped in different markets, usually that cater to tourists. At the same time, these people are making the decisions, I got to get out. So you can have markets that really turn on a dime in terms of not a lot of inventory to all of a sudden way more inventory that folks could have imagined. So the only other element I'll mention here too, again, I'll mention Melody Wright's name again. She is a real estate market expert, but she really cut her teeth in the mortgage industry. Delinquencies that she's seeing in the data now are really frightening her. And in certain cases, they are echoing what she saw in 2008. And in some cases, maybe even some trends are even a little bit worse in certain cases. People will do everything they can before they have to give up the roof above their house. But we're already seeing, other types of debt, credit card debt, auto debt. We've seen the defaults start to spike there. We're beginning to see it in mortgages as well in a way that an expert like Melody is like, this is scarily looking like how it started in 2008. At some point, this conversation may be one in the future. When we scratch at topics like this, because I have the exact same fears or concerns you have about the housing market. This also people kind of losing faith in their income prospects, but the casino of the market's going to come through for me, right? These are all signs basically of an increasingly desperate consumer household where we've had this K-shaped recovery since COVID, right? Where those who have owned financial assets have done fine, but the bottom 80+% is increasingly disadvantaged. And obviously I think that was a big part behind Trump's winning the popular vote, is you had enough people saying, hey, the status quo just isn't doing for me. I got to go with the other guy. I see too many reasons for concern that trajectory is going to continue. I don't see a ton of reasons right now where I get real optimistic that U.S. consumer is actually going to start getting a lot better on a secular trajectory. And so, a big question I kind of wrestle with these days is like, yeah, all right, well, if we keep going down that route, what are the implications? And maybe we're all worried about some financial corrective event here, some financial crisis. Maybe should we be more worried about a social one where enough people just say, you know what, the American system isn't working for me anymore, and they become more desperate in their reactions. I think Buffett is, to his credit, walking his talk, right? He's saying, look, when things get too rich, you don't play, right? And to his credit, he has been early. His critics would say that he's missed the party in, two best years in the stock market this century. And, we all interview people on our programs, and a lot of the longtime capital managers that I talk to, at least, have been increasingly conservative as we've gone through 2024. And they're getting the slings and arrows that you tend to get kind of at the end of an upcycle, especially kind of a manic cycle we're in right now, where people are saying, you guys are hurting your clients because you're sitting out on this party, right? But these guys have seen enough market cycles where they believe, like it seems Buffett does, that we know how this ends. And we know for the long run where we serve our interests and our clients' interests much better by not getting caught up in the fervor and the froth, and then having dry capital to deploy later on at much better valuations after the froth gets let out of the system. Now, nobody has a crystal ball. Time will tell whether Buffett is right or wrong, but at least I can say he's being consistent to the philosophies that he's advised over the years. In addition to there may be games within the games and stuff that we don't see that we need to be critically minded for. Even if there aren't, there's heavy lifting that has to be done for all the reasons we've discussed. Trump trying to get from where we are today to where he wants to go. Yeah. It's going to require a lot of disruption and near-term pain that you and I just talked about, right? So that's if nothing else crazy happens. So now we have, what are recession odds? If we end up going into recession, that could obviously throw a big monkey wrench into the mix here too. But also just like geopolitically, right? I mean, literally in just the past couple of months, we've had the leadership of France, South Korea, Germany, and then potentially in the day we're talking here, Canada, basically get removed for votes of no confidence. The geopolitical chessboard is changing in real time here. Notice I didn't mention Syria, obviously all the stuff that's going on elsewhere in the Middle East and whatnot. Like the people that Trump might be interacting with geopolitically next year, he might not even know yet who they're going to be. They probably will be totally new people. So, and that's just one example. But, we as investors, we deal with probabilities, right? And there's lots of things that we say, well, I'm not going to invest for that because that could never happen. Well, there are a lot of times where something that we are all certain could never happen all of a sudden becomes reality overnight, right? I don't think anybody was expecting the 50-year Syrian Assad regime to disappear overnight the way that it did, right? As I mentioned before many times, right before Biden got on the stage to debate Trump, I mean, anybody, certainly in the Democratic Party, imagined that he would not be the candidate 2 months later, right? There's just a lot of these kind of gray and black swans that can happen out there. So we've got tough sledding ahead of us, even if nothing changes, out of the ordinary. We also have to have the critical thinking that reserve capacity for, okay, there's going to be some pretty big monkey wrenches tossed in here yet. We don't know what they're going to be, but we got to be prepared to be surprised while we're trying to get this big bolus of work done. There's going to be a lot of dust in the air going forward, but there may be a real reason to be optimistic. If you look at Syria kind of collapsing overnight, Israel taking out a lot of the military installations there so that the threat to Israel from Syria is greatly reduced, probably setting Syria back decades militarily. Israel had already hit Iran, in some compromising ways in its retaliation, and it's gone super hard after Hamas and Hezbollah. So where I'm going with this is, okay, Israel's being made stronger, Iran is weakening, Donald Trump is coming into office, who already very publicly sent a warning to some of Israel's foes saying, hey, you better wrap this up by the time I'm inaugurated or there's going to be, hell to pay. He also has been very vocal about wanting to bring an end to the Ukraine-Russia war too, right? So with Trump coming into office and these recent developments in the Middle East, Americans are still quite divided, but they're not quite as divided as they were, right? Say in 2016 or 2020, with Trump winning the popular vote, having a clear mandate, the culture kind of moderating, as you mentioned earlier. So the question is like, yeah, there's a lot of dust in the air and there's a lot going on. It's probably not gonna be all that pretty, but is the world becoming more stable here all of a sudden? Maybe does the world have an opportunity to become more stable more quickly than folks were thinking even just a week or two ago? And I maybe hold out a kernel of hope here that, yeah, things are probably going to be, chaotic to say the least in the Middle East for a while. But this shift might actually be opening the door for making some real progress on some of the things that have been most destabilizing geopolitically over the past 2 years. This was one of my other main themes for 2025 that I'm looking at, which is I think the dichotomy right now is the expectations of the market are completely misaligned. There isn't this sense of, hey, we're going to have to take our hard lumps and our medicine to get to the promised land. If I were advising the Trump campaign, I would be trying to, get some sort of like war style messaging of, look, this is a big problem, maybe even bigger than I thought when I was coming in here. But now that I see it, it's a good thing I'm here. I've got these great plans, but we're all going to have to sacrifice collectively to make the better future happen. We're not there right now. So I just see an uncomfortably high probability that the market is going to have to reset its expectations, and that is going to be a big reset in price, catching a lot of investors by surprise.